Racist cops wrongfully arrests a black woman until she calls her brother the U.S. Attorney General. The morning air in downtown Chicago carried the scent of freshly brewed coffee, mingling with the city's usual blend of car exhaust and hurried conversations. Serena Carter adjusted the strap of her leather handbag as she stepped into Brew and Bean, her favorite coffee shop. A small reprieve before a long day filled with case reviews, meetings, and legal arguments. As a top civil rights attorney, Serena had spent years defending those who couldn't defend themselves. But today she wasn't thinking about courtrooms or depositions. She just wanted her caramel macchiato before heading to work. The line inside was busy. Men in crisp suits, women in tailored blazers, students glued to their laptops. It was the usual morning rush. She glanced at her watch, 7:43 a.m. If the barista worked fast, she'd be back in her car by 7:50, just in time to beat the worst of rush hour traffic. She stepped forward, her mind already flipping through her to-do list. Then a sharp voice cut through the hum of the cafe. "Hey, stop her!" For a second, Serena thought she must have misheard. But when she turned, her breath caught. Two uniformed officers were storming toward her. One was tall, broad-shouldered, with a buzz cut and a badge that read E. Grady. The other was shorter, stockier, with a reddish beard and the name M. Calloway stitched onto his uniform. Their hands hovered near their belts, eyes locked onto her like she was prey. The entire cafe seemed to freeze, conversations halting mid-sentence. Serena's pulse spiked. "Me?" She pointed to herself, her brows knitting together. "Excuse me?" Grady's voice was sharp and authoritative. "Hands where we can see them." Confusion flickered across Serena's face. Her hands instinctively lifted slightly, though her mind reeled. What was happening? Calloway grabbed her wrist roughly, his grip vice-like. "You match the description of a suspect we're looking for," he said flatly. "You need to come with us." The words hit Serena like a slap. A suspect? A murmur rippled through the cafe, customers shifting in their seats. A few already had their phones out, recording. Serena yanked her arm back, but Calloway tightened his grip. "I just walked in here to get coffee," she said, trying to keep her voice even. Grady wasn't listening. He pulled out a pair of handcuffs. "Ma'am, don't make this difficult." The cold metal snapped around her wrists before she could process what was happening. Serena inhaled sharply, her heart slamming against her ribs. She was no stranger to wrongful arrests. She had spent years defending innocent people from this very scenario. But now, she was living it. A woman near the register, a young black woman in her 20s, clutched her phone with trembling hands. "She didn't do anything," she said, her voice shaking. "She just got here." "Stay out of this," Calloway barked. Serena squared her shoulders, exhaling through her nose. "You should listen to her," she said. But they didn't. Instead, they dragged her toward the door, the entire cafe watching in stunned silence. As the morning sun hit Serena's face, her shock turned to controlled fury. She refused to let them see her break. Instead, she lifted her chin and spoke 6 words that changed everything. "Do you know who I am?" Calloway scoffed. "Yeah, a suspect." Serena smiled coldly. "No, I'm Serena Carter." A flicker of recognition crossed Grady's face, but he didn't let go. Serena leaned in slightly, her voice calm, lethal. "And my brother is U.S. Attorney General Jordan Carter." The color drained from Calloway's face. Grady hesitated. That name meant something. The biggest mistake of their careers had just begun. Serena Carter sat rigid in the back of the police car, her wrists aching from the tight handcuffs. The cold steel bit into her skin, a sharp reminder of the injustice she was now living through. The squad car smelled of stale coffee and synthetic leather, but Serena barely noticed. All she could feel was the burning anger simmering in her chest. Officer Calloway sat in the driver's seat, his hands gripping the wheel a little too tightly. His partner, Grady, leaned back in his seat, a smirk playing at his lips, as if he had already written this story in his mind. He thought he knew how this would end, just another routine arrest. But Serena knew better. She had seen too many of these cases unfold, representing clients who had been humiliated, handcuffed, and thrown into a cell based on nothing but assumption and prejudice. She had fought in courtrooms to expose police misconduct, to hold departments accountable for wrongful arrests, and now, she was living it. Calloway glanced at her through the rearview mirror. "You got an attitude problem, lady," he muttered. "That mouth of yours won't help you." Serena inhaled deeply, steadying herself. She had spent years perfecting the power of restraint, and she wasn't about to let them see her crack. "Hope you're ready for a long day," Grady added with a low chuckle. Serena tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. "Oh, I'm ready." She met his gaze in the mirror. "But the real question is, are you?" Grady smirked. "Lady, I've been on this job 15 years. I've seen all kinds of tough talk. Let me guess, you're about to throw a fancy lawsuit at us?" Serena exhaled slowly, shaking her head. "You still don't get it." Calloway scoffed. "Get what?" Serena's lips curled into a knowing smile. "Not just any suit." Her voice remained calm, deliberate. "The U.S. Attorney General, the man with direct access to the DOJ, the FBI, and every major legal authority in the country." Silence. Grady's smirk disappeared. Calloway cleared his throat, shifting in his seat. Serena watched the fear creep in. They knew exactly how bad this was. "Go ahead," she said, nodding toward the radio. "Call him." For the first time since the arrest, neither officer spoke. Calloway hesitated before picking up the radio. "Dispatch, run a background check on a Serena Carter." Static crackled. Then, Officer Calloway?" The voice on the other end sounded different, hesitant. "Yeah?" A pause. "Are you sure about this arrest?" Serena smiled. "Here we go." Officer Calloway's grip on the radio tightened. His jaw flexed as he glanced at his partner, Officer Grady, who was now shifting uncomfortably in his seat. The response from dispatch was not what they had expected. "What do you mean? Are you sure?" Calloway asked, his voice laced with impatience. There was another pause before dispatch came back, this time slower, more deliberate. "We just ran a full background check on Serena Carter." A hesitation. "You're going to want to check this twice." Grady furrowed his brow, suddenly uneasy. "What the hell does that mean?" "It means you just arrested the wrong person." Dispatch replied carefully. "Serena Carter is an attorney." The weight of those words settled into the car like a thick fog. Grady's fingers twitched near his belt, and Calloway's eyes darted to the rearview mirror where Serena sat. She hadn't moved, hadn't spoken. Then came the final blow. "Her emergency contact is Malcolm Carter," dispatch added, "the United States Attorney General." Grady let out a low curse under his breath. Calloway's face paled. Serena leaned back against the seat, watching the slow realization dawn on them. Now they understood. The air in the squad car grew suffocatingly thick. Calloway swallowed hard. He could feel the mistake unraveling in real time, each piece falling into place like a cruel puzzle. Serena spoke first. "I told you," she said, her voice measured, controlled. "You should have run my name before throwing me in cuffs." Grady turned in his seat, his bravado slipping. "Look," he started, but Serena raised a hand, silencing him. "Save it," she said. "Your words mean nothing. What's going to happen next? That's what matters." Calloway's hand hovered over the radio. "What do you want us to do?" he asked, his voice quieter now. Serena tilted her head, considering the question. "Well, for starters, you can uncuff me." A beat passed. Then Calloway, knowing there was no salvaging this, reached for the keys. The cuffs clicked open. Serena rubbed her wrists slowly, feeling the sting of freedom. The sharp red marks on her skin were a reminder of how close she had come to being just another statistic. Grady exhaled heavily. "Listen, this was a mistake." Serena let out a dry, humorless laugh. "A mistake?" She arched an eyebrow. "A mistake is forgetting to set your alarm. This was negligence, profiling, false arrest. Take your pick." The silence that followed was deafening. Then, Serena pulled out her phone. Calloway stiffened. "What are you doing?" he asked. Serena didn't look up as she pressed a number and lifted the phone to her ear. "I'm making a call." 2 rings. Then a voice. "Malcolm Carter speaking." Serena's gaze locked onto the officers. "Malcolm, you're going to want to hear this." And just like that, everything changed. The weight of the moment hung thick in the air. The only sound in the squad car was the faint crackle of the radio and Serena's steady breathing. Officer Calloway felt his pulse thundering in his ears, while Officer Grady sat rigidly, his grip tightening on his belt. The words that had just left Serena's mouth carried the weight of a tidal wave, one they hadn't seen coming, and now they were drowning in it. "Serena?" Malcolm Carter's voice was sharp, alert, instantly recognizing that something was wrong. "Where are you?" Serena exhaled slowly, rolling her stiff wrists, the marks from the cuffs burning against her skin. "I'm in the back of a police car." A beat of silence. Then, Malcolm's voice dropped to a dangerous calm. "Why?" Serena's gaze never wavered from the two officers in front of her as she answered, "Because I got arrested on my way to get coffee." Calloway felt his throat go dry. He could already hear the shift in Malcolm's breathing, the unmistakable fury he was barely holding back. "Who are the officers?" Malcolm demanded. Calloway and Grady exchanged a glance. They had gone from arrogant enforcers of the law to two men trapped under the full weight of their own actions. Serena let the silence stretch before she spoke again. "Officer Calloway and Officer Grady," she said, her voice razor sharp. "They threw me in cuffs without running my name, without confirming any details. And oh, here's the best part, accused me of robbery." Calloway could feel his lungs constricting as if the walls were closing in. Malcolm's voice turned lethal. "Put me on speaker." Serena obliged, pressing the button and holding the phone out. The car suddenly felt smaller, suffocating under the weight of what was about to happen. "This is Malcolm Carter," he said, his voice booming through the speakers. "United States Attorney General. Now, one of you explain to me exactly what just happened." Neither officer moved. Grady's mouth opened, then closed, his face drained of color. Calloway attempted to speak, but no words came. Malcolm's voice was dangerously low. "I asked a question." Grady stammered first. "Sir, we received a description of a suspect, and she fit the profile." "Fit the profile?" Malcolm repeated, his tone now icy. "You mean you saw a black woman and decided that was good enough?" Grady shut his mouth. "Did you run her ID before cuffing her?" Malcolm asked. Silence. "Did you confirm her whereabouts?" Silence again. "Do your body cameras work, or did they conveniently malfunction?" Calloway finally spoke up, though his voice was barely above a whisper. "They're on." "Good," Malcolm snapped. "Because you're going to be turning over that footage immediately. And if I find so much as a second of misconduct, you two won't just lose your badges, you'll never work in law enforcement again." Grady's hands were shaking now. "Sir, You arrested my sister without cause," Malcolm interrupted. "You threw her in cuffs, humiliated her in public, and if she didn't have the right connections, she'd be sitting in a cell right now waiting for someone to believe her. Tell me, officers, is this how you operate? How many times have you done this before?" Neither of them answered. Serena watched them squirm, their earlier confidence completely shattered. She had seen this before. Officers who only felt regret when they realized they had messed with the wrong person, not because they had done something unjust, but because it had consequences for them. Malcolm exhaled sharply. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to drive Serena back to the exact place you picked her up from. You're going to uncuff her in front of every single witness who saw you drag her out of that cafe. And then you're going to prepare for what's coming next. Because I promise you, this is just the beginning." Calloway clenched his jaw. "Sir, please." "You don't get to plead your case," Malcolm snapped. "You had your chance when you chose to profile my sister instead of doing your job properly." Grady slumped in his seat, his hands trembling. "What if we do this? Will she drop everything?" Serena tilted her head. "You think I should just walk away from this?" Calloway sighed. "Look, we made a mistake, all right? Mistakes don't put handcuffs on innocent people," she cut in. "Mistakes don't throw people into the back of a police car and strip them of their dignity." Grady shut his eyes briefly, knowing there was no undoing what had already been done. Malcolm's voice came through one last time, crisp and final. "Take her back, now." Calloway and Grady had no choice but to obey. And as they turned the car around, Serena knew this wasn't just a mistake they'd made. This was a reckoning. The squad car was silent except for the hum of the engine as Calloway and Grady drove Serena back toward Brew and Bean. Neither officer spoke, but their tension was palpable. Grady's fingers tapped erratically against the steering wheel, while Calloway stared straight ahead, his jaw tight. Serena sat in the back seat, rubbing her sore wrists, the faint imprint of the cuffs still fresh on her skin. She had been in worse situations before, standing in front of a judge who thought she was too emotional in court, negotiating settlements with law firms that wanted to sweep injustices under the rug. But this was personal. Not just because it had happened to her, but because she knew that if she had been anyone else, she wouldn't be on her way back. The reality of it settled heavily in the car, pressing down on the officers like a weight they couldn't shake. They had gotten away with this before. How many times had they thrown someone into the back of their car, certain that there would be no consequences? That their word would be enough to justify their actions? That no one would believe the person they humiliated, detained, or mistreated? But today was different. Today they had made a mistake they couldn't erase. As the squad car pulled up to the curb outside the coffee shop, Serena could already see the crowd gathered outside. Word had spread quickly. Some customers who had been inside when it happened were still there, their arms crossed, faces tight with anger. Others had come after hearing the story, drawn in by whispers and social media updates. Phones were out, cameras rolling. This was no longer just an embarrassing mistake. This was a public spectacle. Serena didn't move immediately. She let the moment stretch, watching Calloway and Grady struggle with their reality. They weren't in control anymore. Finally, Calloway sighed and turned in his seat, his voice quieter than before. "We're here." Serena arched an eyebrow. "Oh, am I free to go now?" Calloway's mouth pressed into a thin line, but he didn't argue. He knew better. Instead, he reached for the door handle and stepped out first. The second he did, voices from the crowd started rising. "Is that her? They're bringing her back? Oh, they know they messed up now." The murmurs turned into something louder, a wave of frustration, anger, and demand for accountability. Serena stepped out of the car on her own, straightening her blazer and dusting off her sleeves. She didn't rush. She wanted them to see. The two officers flanked her, looking stiff and uncomfortable as they faced the very people who had watched them throw an innocent woman into a police car just 30 minutes earlier. The young woman from before, the one who had spoken up for her, was still standing near the cafe entrance. Her phone was in her hand, recording. Serena met her gaze and gave her a small nod, acknowledging the courage it had taken to speak out when so many others had remained silent. Then, with deliberate slowness, Serena turned back to Calloway and Grady. "Go ahead." Grady shifted uncomfortably. "Go ahead with what?" Serena tilted her head. "The part where you uncuff me, publicly, just like you did when you arrested me." A fresh wave of murmurs rippled through the crowd. The businessman from earlier crossed his arms, shaking his head. "They should apologize, too." Calloway swallowed hard but nodded stiffly. He reached forward and with trembling hands removed the cuffs from Serena's wrists. The moment the cold steel left her skin, she flexed her fingers and rolled her wrists dramatically, making sure the cameras caught every movement. Applause erupted from the crowd, but Serena wasn't done. She turned back to the officers, adjusting her blazer, her eyes locked onto them like a predator eyeing prey. "Now say it," Grady frowned. "Say what?" Serena's voice was sharp, unwavering. "That you made a mistake, that you had no right to arrest me." Calloway's nostrils flared. He glanced at the crowd, at the cameras, then at Grady, who looked equally sick. But they both knew they had no choice. Calloway exhaled through his nose before speaking, his voice tight. "We made an error." "An error?" Serena repeated. "You threw me in handcuffs. You humiliated me in front of strangers. You assumed I was guilty because I fit a description." "That's not an error. That's profiling." Grady's face was blotchy red. He was struggling to keep his temper in check, but Serena wasn't letting up. "Not today." "Say it." Her voice was soft, but it carried the force of a tidal wave. Calloway clenched his jaw and forced the words out. "We were wrong." Another round of murmurs from the crowd. Serena watched their faces, saw the way the words didn't come easily, the way their pride fought against the truth, but it was too late for them to take it back now. Serena nodded. "Good. Now turn around and walk away." Grady blinked. "What?" She crossed her arms. "You came in here like you owned the place, like you were in control of my life for those few minutes. But now? Now you leave, because you don't get to stand here and act like this goes away just because you admitted fault." Grady wanted to argue, wanted to salvage whatever dignity he had left, but the look in Serena's eyes told him he was out of time. Calloway gave a stiff nod, nudged Grady, and together they turned and walked back to their squad car. As they drove away, the weight of the moment hung in the air. Serena turned back to the crowd, and for the first time since this ordeal began, she smiled. Not because justice had been served, because it hadn't, not fully, but because this time someone had fought back, and the world had watched it happen. Watched it happen. The tension in the air lingered even after Calloway and Grady disappeared from view. The crowd was still murmuring, the energy electric with a mix of outrage and satisfaction. People were shaking their heads, whispering to each other about what had just happened. Some looked relieved, others infuriated. Serena, standing tall in the midst of it all, knew this moment wouldn't be enough, not in the grand scheme of things. She turned toward the young woman who had spoken up for her earlier. "What's your name?" Serena asked, her voice softer now, no longer sharpened by the heat of confrontation. The woman hesitated for only a second before answering. "Maya." Serena offered a small nod. "Thank you, Maya. You did the right thing back there." Maya let out a breath, shifting on her feet. I couldn't stand there and watch it happen, but it didn't stop them." Her fingers curled around her phone. "They still took you." Serena tilted her head slightly, reading the frustration in Maya's expression. "But it mattered. People like you speaking up, it makes all the difference." Maya swallowed hard and nodded, but she still looked unconvinced. From the other side of the crowd, a journalist stepped forward, notebook in hand. "Miss Carter, can I get a statement?" Serena turned toward him, her expression unreadable. Of course, she had spent her career shaping words into weapons, crafting arguments that forced people to listen. But right now, she didn't need strategy. She just needed truth. She faced the journalist and the cameras still trained on her. "This isn't just about me," she began, voice clear and steady. "This is about how often things like this happen to people who don't have the right name, the right connections, the right resources to fight back. How many times has this happened in places without cameras, without witnesses?" A ripple of agreement moved through the crowd. Serena continued, her gaze sweeping over the people watching. "I was lucky, but luck shouldn't be a factor in justice. I shouldn't have needed my brother to pull strings. I shouldn't have needed a viral moment to prove my innocence. No one should." The journalist scribbled notes, his brow furrowed in concentration. "So what happens next?" Serena took a slow breath. "Accountability, transparency, and change." These officers walked away embarrassed today, but that's not enough. I want policy shifts. I want every wrongful arrest reviewed. I want new procedures that force law enforcement to think twice before assuming guilt based on nothing but skin color. More murmurs from the crowd. Some were nodding, some were recording, and Serena knew that her words were already making their way to places beyond this coffee shop, to people who needed to hear them. She turned back to Maya, handing her a business card. "If you ever see something like this happen again, call me. I'll make sure it doesn't get ignored." Maya stared at the card for a moment, before gripping it tightly. "I will." Serena exhaled slowly, adjusting her bag on her shoulder. The battle wasn't over, but today, at least, they had won one small fight. Serena exhaled slowly, watching as the weight of the situation fully settled on Calloway and Grady's shoulders. Their once confident expressions were now laced with unease, their eyes darting between each other as if searching for an escape route. But there wasn't one. The press conference was set. The city was watching, and now their careers, their reputations, everything they had built, hung in the balance. The police chief cleared his throat, his voice strained as he stepped up to the podium. "We acknowledge that a grave mistake was made today," he began, his words slow and deliberate. "Miss Carter was wrongfully detained due to an unfortunate misidentification, and for that we offer our sincere apologies." Serena studied his face. She had seen enough public apologies to know when they were just empty words. The chief wasn't sorry for what had happened. He was sorry that it had happened to her. To someone who had the power to fight back. She turned to the crowd, her voice firm. "An apology isn't enough. It never is. What happens next will show whether this department is serious about change. We need action, not just words." The murmurs from the crowd grew louder, cameras flashing, reporters scrambling to capture every word. Calloway and Grady stood stiffly behind the podium, their earlier arrogance now replaced by quiet dread. They knew their fate was no longer in their hands. Serena took one last look at them before stepping away from the microphones. This was only the beginning. Life has taught us that silence in the face of injustice allows wrongdoing to continue unchecked. Serena's story is a reminder that when we hold those in power accountable, we create ripples of change that extend far beyond ourselves. Too often, people without the right connections or influence are left voiceless, victims of a system that overlooks them. But standing firm, demanding fairness, and refusing to back down can force even the most rigid institutions to acknowledge their mistakes. For older generations who have seen history unfold, this lesson resonates deeply. Change doesn't happen overnight, but it begins when ordinary people dare to challenge the status quo. It is not about seeking revenge, but about ensuring fairness, dignity, and respect for everyone. The measure of a just society is not how it treats its most powerful, but how it safeguards the rights of its most vulnerable. Whether through a conversation, a vote, or a simple act of standing up for someone, we all have the ability to make a difference. As long as we continue to fight for what is right, justice will always have a voice.